The moonlight cast long shadows across the small cemetery as Griffin McAllister's shovel bit into the earth with rhythmic determination. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the autumn chill, his broad shoulders working steadily as he dug deeper into Wyoming soil. The graveyard sat on a gentle rise overlooking his modest ranch, where four small children slept peacefully in the cabin below, unaware of their father's midnight labor. Griffin paused, leaning on his shovel to catch his breath. His weathered face, handsome despite the lines of grief etched around his eyes, turned toward the wooden cross marking the grave of his wife Margaret. The simple marker had weathered poorly in the harsh frontier elements, the name already fading after just 1 year. "Almost done, Maggie," he whispered to the night air. 3 months earlier, Griffin McAllister had been certain he would soon be joining his beloved wife beneath the prairie soil. June 1876 arrived with merciless heat to the Wyoming Territory. Griffin McAllister knelt to retrieve a small wooden horse from beneath the porch steps of his cabin. The toy belonged to his son Luke, one half of the 2-year-old twin terrors who kept Griffin constantly vigilant. The other twin, Matthew, was the more cautious of the pair, but Luke seemed determined to find new ways to court danger daily. The warning rattle came too late. Griffin's hand had already reached into the shadow beneath the steps when the snake struck fangs, sinking deep into his forearm. Pain shot through him like liquid fire as he jerked backward, catching sight of the diamondback rattlesnake as it retreated further under the porch. "Damn it all," Griffin muttered, clutching his wrist as the venom began its deadly work. The cabin door remained closed, his 4 children still napping inside, blissfully unaware that they might soon become complete orphans. Griffin staggered to his feet, his vision already swimming. The nearest neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, lived 5 miles away and had gone to visit her sister in Cheyenne. The doctor in Willow Creek was 15 miles in the opposite direction. Griffin lurched toward the well, knowing he needed to clean the wound and bind it before attempting to ride for help. But the venom worked quickly, making his legs unsteady beneath him. He collapsed onto the porch steps, the world tilting dangerously around him. The small ranch stretched before his blurring vision. The modest cabin he'd built with his own hands, the barn housing 2 horses and 3 milk cows, the vegetable garden Margaret had started that he'd managed to keep alive. All of it would be waste if he couldn't survive this. A year since cholera had taken his beloved Margaret, leaving him alone with 4 babies under the age of 3. The twins Matthew and Luke were now 2 years old. Charlotte, his sweet little girl, had just turned 18 months, and baby Henry, only 6 months old, would never know his mother, who had died just weeks after his birth. The irony wasn't lost on Griffin. He had survived the bloodiest conflict in American history, fought at Gettysburg, and marched with Sherman, only to meet his end from a rattlesnake on his own property while his children slept unaware. His thoughts turned to Mason Reed, the bank owner in Willow Creek, who had been pressuring him about the loan payments. If Griffin died, Reed would waste no time for closing on the property. The children would be separated, sent to orphanages or distant relatives who'd never even met them. As consciousness began to slip away, Griffin saw a figure approaching on horseback, the silhouette shimmering in the heat haze like a mirage. For a delirious moment, he thought Margaret had returned to him, come to guide him to the afterlife. But as the rider drew closer, he saw it was a woman he didn't recognize. Auburn hair escaped from beneath her bonnet, and she rode with the confident posture of someone who knew these lands despite her city clothes. "Hello there," she called, then must have noticed his distress because she urged her horse faster. "Sir, are you hurt?" she asked, pulling her mount to a stop in a swirl of dust. "Rattlesnake," Griffin managed, his voice strained. "My children are inside asleep." The woman dismounted in one fluid motion, tying a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread to her saddle before rushing to his side. "I'm Eleanor Harlow," she said quickly, examining the wound with capable hands. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might need help with your little ones while she's away, so I brought some bread as an introduction." "Griffin McAllister," he replied, fighting to stay conscious. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Harlow, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Call me Eleanor," she said, already tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wrist. "And you're lucky I'm here, Mr. McAllister. My father was a doctor in Boston. I've treated snake bites before." Through the haze of pain, Griffin watched as Eleanor pulled a small knife from her boot and without hesitation made a precise incision over the fang marks. Her movements were sure and practiced as she extracted what venom she could. "I need to get you to a doctor," she said, her green eyes serious as she tied the bandage tight. "But your children, A small cry from inside the cabin interrupted her, followed by the patter of tiny feet. The cabin door creaked open, and Charlotte peered out, her blonde hair tousled from sleep, her eyes widening at the sight of the stranger. "Papa hurt?" the little girl asked, her bottom lip trembling. "Papa will be fine," Eleanor assured her with a gentle smile. "I'm Miss Harlow. Would you like to help me take care of your father?" Griffin tried to protest, to tell her there was no use, that the venom was spreading too quickly, but Eleanor hushed him. "I've seen worse bites than this, Mr. McAllister. You're not dying today. Not when you have 4 little ones who need you." She turned to Charlotte. "Are your brothers awake too?" Charlotte nodded solemnly. "Good. I need your help, brave girl. Can you watch them while I help your father to his bed?" With surprising strength, Eleanor helped Griffin to his feet and guided him inside the cabin. The interior was neat, but showed signs of a man struggling alone, clothing waiting to be mended, toys scattered about, dishes piled in the wash basin. The twins were sitting up in their shared bed, expressions of curiosity and concern on their identical faces. Baby Henry fussed in a hand-carved cradle nearby. All of them stared wide-eyed at the stranger supporting their father. "Children, this is Miss Harlow," Griffin said weakly as Eleanor helped him onto his bed. "She's going to help us for a little while." As Griffin's consciousness faded, he was vaguely aware of Eleanor settling the children, her voice soft and reassuring. Just before darkness claimed him completely, he noticed her open a small satchel, removing a glass vial with amber liquid and a small leather-bound journal. Through half-closed eyes, he saw her glance at a family portrait on the wall, Margaret holding baby Henry with the twins, and Charlotte gathered around her before quickly looking away with an expression Griffin couldn't quite decipher. When Griffin next awoke, the room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. Eleanor sat beside him when wiping his brow with a cool cloth. Night had fallen and the cabin was quiet. "The children?" he asked, his voice a rasp. "Fed, bathed, and sleeping soundly," Eleanor replied. "You've been unconscious for several hours. I gave you a tincture that should help slow the venom." Griffin tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. "I need to get to a doctor." "You're in no condition to ride," Eleanor said firmly. "I've done what I can for now, but you need proper medical attention. I'll have to go for the doctor myself." 15 miles to town," Griffin protested. "You can't leave the children alone." "I've ridden farther in worse conditions," she replied, her expression resolute. "I'll go as soon as I'm certain you're stable and the children are settled for the night." Griffin studied her face in the lamplight, the determined set of her jaw, the light dusting of freckles across her nose, the intelligence in her eyes. There was something both familiar and mysterious about her, as though he'd seen her somewhere before but couldn't place where. "Why would you do all this for strangers?" he asked. A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. "Because no one did it for me when I needed it most," she said softly. She checked his bandage, avoiding his gaze. "The fever hasn't set in yet, which is a good sign. I've given you something for the pain and to slow the venom. It should hold until I can bring the doctor." As she turned to leave, Griffin caught her wrist. "My children will be fine," she assured him. "The twins understand they're to stay inside and only come to you if there's an emergency. Charlotte has appointed herself my deputy nurse and promised to be very brave." A smile softened her features. "They're remarkable children, Mr. McAllister. You should be proud." Griffin relaxed slightly, though concern still gnawed at him. "Thank you, Miss Harlow." "Eleanor," she corrected gently. "Eleanor," he repeated the name, feeling strangely right on his lips. After ensuring Griffin was comfortable, Eleanor slipped out of the bedroom. Through the partially open door, Griffin watched as she moved around the main room of the cabin, checking on the sleeping children. She paused at the fireplace where Margaret's portrait hung, studying it with an unreadable expression. Then, when she thought no one was watching, she pulled out the small journal he'd seen earlier and made a notation, her brow furrowed in concentration. Griffin's eyelids grew heavy, the medicine taking effect. As he drifted back to sleep, he wondered about this mysterious woman who had appeared like an angel bearing bread when he needed help most desperately. There was more to Eleanor Harlow than she was revealing, but in his current state, he couldn't begin to guess what secrets she might be hiding. Eleanor Harlow rode through the darkness with single-minded determination, pushing her horse as fast as she dared on the unfamiliar trail. The moon provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles, But the journey was treacherous. Twice she heard the howl of wolves in the distance, and once she was certain something large crossed the path ahead of her, but she pressed on. The 15 miles to Willow Creek stretched endlessly before her. Her thoughts kept returning to the cabin behind her, to the four small children sleeping under the watchful eyes of the oldest twins, to their father fighting the snake's venom. Griffin McAllister. The name had stunned her when he'd introduced himself, though she'd hidden her reaction well. She'd known she would eventually find the McAllister family. That had been her purpose in coming to Wyoming after all, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly or under such circumstances. Miss Patterson's casual mention of a widower with four young children had been the confirmation she needed, but Eleanor had planned to approach the situation carefully, not to be thrust directly into their lives by a rattlesnake bite. Now racing through the night to save Griffin McAllister's life, Eleanor felt the weight of her secret like a physical burden. The leather journal in her saddlebag seemed to grow heavier with each mile. She reached Willow Creek shortly after midnight, the small frontier town dark except for the saloon. Eleanor reined her horse to a stop outside a modest house with a small sign identifying it as the doctor's residence. She pounded on the door until a light appeared inside. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, white-haired and bearded, pulling a robe around his nightshirt. "Dr. Wilson," Eleanor asked breathlessly. "Yes, what is it?" he replied, squinting at her in the darkness. "A man's been bitten by a rattlesnake 15 miles west of here. Griffin McAllister. I've treated him as best I could, but he needs proper medical attention." Dr. Wilson's expression grew serious. "McAllister, you say Margaret's husband," Eleanor nodded. "You knew his wife." "I attended her in her final days," the doctor said grimly. "Couldn't save her from the cholera. Those poor children." He turned back into the house. "Give me 10 minutes to gather my supplies and saddle my horse." While Dr. Wilson prepared, Eleanor found herself drawn to the small cemetery adjacent to the church across the street. By the light of the moon, she located a fresh grave with a simple wooden marker, "Jonathan Winters, 1846 to 1875. May he find peace." Eleanor knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the carved letters. "Oh, Johnny," she whispered, "what happened to you here?" She hadn't known her brother was buried in Willow Creek. She'd tracked him this far, but lost his trail after he'd left Boston in disgrace. Finding his grave was both a shock and in some strange way a relief. At least now she knew. "Miss, I'm ready to go." Eleanor turned to find Dr. Wilson watching her medical bag in hand, his horse saddled behind him. "Did you know him?" the doctor asked, nodding toward the grave. "He was my brother," Eleanor replied quietly. Dr. Wilson's expression softened with recognition. "You're Eleanor Harlow. He spoke of you. Before he died." The doctor nodded. "He wasn't in Willow Creek long, but he assisted me with several patients. Brilliant young man, but troubled. The incident with Mrs. McAllister affected him deeply." Eleanor felt her heart constrict. "What incident?" Dr. Wilson gave her a long look. "Perhaps that's a conversation for another time. Right now we have a man to save." They rode back to the McAllister ranch in tense silence, pushing their horses as fast as safety allowed. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they arrived at the cabin, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn gray. Inside, they found Griffin burning with fever, his arms swollen and discolored around the bandage. The children were still asleep, though Charlotte had crawled into bed beside her father, her small hand clutching his uninjured one. Dr. Wilson examined the wound, nodding approvingly at Eleanor's treatment. "You've done well, Miss Harlow. The incisions were precisely placed and your tincture appears to have slowed the venom's progress. Without your intervention, I dare say we'd be planning a funeral instead of a recovery." He administered an anti-venom serum and additional treatments, then repacked his bag. "He'll need rest and careful monitoring for the next few days. The fever should break by tomorrow if all goes well, but that arm won't be much use for at least 2 weeks." Eleanor's heart sank at this news. 2 weeks without being able to work meant potential ruin for Griffin's small ranch. The crops needed tending, the animals feeding, and the children required constant care. "I'll stay," Eleanor announced, prizing both herself and the doctor. "School doesn't start for another month, and I've nowhere pressing to be." Dr. Wilson raised an eyebrow. "That's very generous, Miss Harlow, but are you certain taking on 4 young children and a ranch?" "I'm no stranger to hard work, doctor," Eleanor replied firmly, "and these children need someone." The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well. I'll return in 3 days to check on his progress. Send word if his condition worsens before then. After the doctor left, Eleanor checked on the still sleeping children, then returned to Griffin's bedside. Charlotte had awakened and was watching her with solemn blue eyes, so like her mother's. Is Papa going to die like Mama did? The little girl asked in a small voice. Eleanor sat beside her, smoothing a hand over the child's tangled blonde curls. No, sweetheart, your Papa is very strong, and the doctor has given him medicine. He's going to get better. Charlotte considered this, then asked, Are you an angel? Startled, Eleanor laughed softly. What makes you ask that? I dreamed about Mama last night, Charlotte said matter-of-factly. She said she was sending an angel to help us, and then you came with bread. A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. I'm not an angel, Charlotte, just a person who wants to help. The little girl shook her head with the certainty only a child could possess. Mama said you'd say that. Before Eleanor could respond, the twins burst into the room, their energy undiminished by the previous day's excitement. Is Pa awake? Luke demanded, the more assertive of the pair. Not yet, Eleanor replied. He needs to rest to get better. Why don't we let him sleep while we make breakfast? Pancakes, Matthew asked, hopefully, his voice quieter than his brother's, but his eyes equally bright. If you help me find the ingredients, Eleanor agreed. As they left the room, Charlotte hung back, looking up at Eleanor with uncanny perception. It's all right, she said, patting Eleanor's hand. Mama's not angry with you. Eleanor froze, her heart racing. What do you mean, sweetheart? But Charlotte just smiled and skipped after her brothers, leaving Eleanor to wonder how much the child somehow intuited about her secret connection to the McAllister family. When Griffin next regained consciousness, the fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Sunlight streamed through the small window of his bedroom, and the house was filled with the unfamiliar sounds of a woman's voice directing children's activities. He managed to push himself up against the headboard, wincing at the pain in his arm. The snake bite was properly bandaged now, but the surrounding area remained swollen and discolored. The door opened and Eleanor entered, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of soup and fresh bread. You're awake, she said, her face lighting with relief. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, Griffin admitted, but alive thanks to you. She set the tray across his lap. Dr. Wilson deserves the credit. I merely kept you alive until he arrived. The children are thriving, Eleanor assured him. The twins are helping collect eggs, and Charlotte is showing me where everything belongs in the kitchen. Henry is napping after his bottle. Griffin looked at her with wonder. You've managed all of them by yourself. They're wonderful children, Mr. McAllister. Very resilient and eager to help. She straightened his covers unnecessarily. Dr. Wilson says you'll need to rest that arm for at least 2 weeks. Griffin's expression darkened. 2 weeks, I can't afford to be laid up that long. The ranch will still be here when you recover, Eleanor finished firmly, and I've offered to stay and help until you're back on your feet. I couldn't ask that of you, Griffin protested. You didn't ask, I offered, she replied with the same determination he'd witnessed the day before. Besides, I've grown rather fond of your little brood in just 1 day. Griffin wanted to argue further, but found himself too weak, and if he were honest, too grateful. Thank you, Eleanor. I don't know how I'll repay you. No repayment necessary, she said, turning to leave. Eat your soup before it gets cold. The children will want to see you once you've had something to eat and regained your strength. Over the next few days, Griffin watched in amazement as Eleanor transformed his household. The cabin, which had merely been surviving under his care, began to thrive under her attention. She cleaned thoroughly mended clothes, cooked nutritious meals, and most importantly, showered the children with the maternal affection they'd been missing. From his sickbed, Griffin observed her singing to baby Henry, teaching Charlotte to help set the table, and taking the twins on short walks to gather eggs from the chicken coop. She seemed to have endless energy and patience, even when all 4 children demanded attention at once. On the 3rd day, Dr. Wilson returned to check on Griffin's progress. The swelling has reduced significantly, the doctor noted, examining the wound. Miss Harlow's herbal poultices have been quite effective. You're healing well, but I still want you to rest that arm for another 10 days at minimum. Griffin sighed in frustration. Doc, I appreciate your concern, but I've got a ranch to run and 4 mouths to feed. And a loan payment due to Mason Reed. Dr. Wilson added knowingly. Griffin's jaw tightened. How did you know about that? Small town, the doctor replied with a shrug. Reed isn't shy about discussing his debtors at the saloon. How much time do you have? 2 months to come up with $300, Griffin said grimly. Nearly impossible in the best of circumstances, let alone with me laid up. Dr. Wilson glanced toward the door where Eleanor's voice could be heard, reading a story to the children. That young woman has been a godsend for you and those children, he said. But there's something you should know about her. Griffin felt a chill that had nothing to do with his recovery. What is it? The doctor hesitated. It's not my place to tell her story. Just know that she came to Wyoming seeking answers about her brother Jonathan Winters. He was briefly my assistant last year before he took his own life. I don't understand, Griffin said. What does that have to do with me or my family? Dr. Wilson gathered his medical bag. Ask her about it when the time is right. She has her reasons for being here, and they're more complex than simply filling in as the new school teacher. After the doctor left, Griffin found himself watching Eleanor with new eyes, wondering what connection she might have to this Jonathan Winters and why she had really come to Wyoming. But as days passed and his strength returned, he found it increasingly difficult to question her presence. The children had blossomed under her care, and the ranch was running more smoothly than it had since Margaret's death. One evening, as Griffin sat in a chair on the porch enjoying the sunset while Eleanor rocked Henry to sleep, he finally found the courage to ask about her past. You mentioned your father was a doctor in Boston, he began. How did you come to be a teacher in Wyoming territory? Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily in their gentle patting of Henry's back. After my parents died in a fire when I was 16, I found myself alone in the world. I trained as a teacher, but Boston held too many painful memories. When I heard about the position in Willow Creek, it seemed like a chance for a fresh start. And your brother, Griffin asked carefully. Dr. Wilson mentioned Jonathan Winters was your brother. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed slightly. Yes, Johnny was my brother. He came west a year before I did. I didn't know what had happened to him until I arrived here. I'm sorry, Griffin said, recognizing the pain in her voice. I didn't mean to pry. It's all right, Eleanor assured him, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Johnny was troubled after the war. He started as a lawyer but switched to medicine, hoping to help people more directly. He made a mistake with a patient and couldn't forgive himself. Griffin thought of Dr. Wilson's cryptic words about Eleanor's reasons for being in Wyoming. This patient. But before he could finish his question, Henry began to fuss, and Eleanor stood to walk him. I should put him down for the night, she said clearly, relieved by the interruption. It's getting chilly out here. You should come inside soon. As she disappeared into the cabin, Griffin remained on the porch, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the horizon. Eleanor Harlow was hiding something connected to her brother and possibly to Griffin's family. But whatever her secrets, he couldn't deny that her presence had been nothing short of miraculous for him and his children. The following morning brought an unwelcome visitor. Griffin was sitting at the kitchen table, his arm still bandaged, but improving enough that he could hold baby Henry when the sound of an approaching horse drew his attention. Eleanor, who had been kneading dough for bread, wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. Her expression darkened. It's a man in a fine suit, she reported, older with a gray beard. He looks important. Griffin's jaw tightened. Mason Reed, he said grimly, passing Henry to Eleanor. The banker I told you about. He stood as Reed's heavy knock sounded on the door, straightening his shoulders despite the pain in his arm. Eleanor stepped back with Henry, positioning herself near the children's bedroom where the twins and Charlotte were playing. Griffin opened the door to find Reed standing on his porch, immaculately dressed, as always, in a three-piece suit despite the frontier setting. At 50, Reed carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, cold and calculating, took in Griffin's bandaged arm with obvious interest. McAllister, Reed said by way of greeting, I heard about your unfortunate accident. News travels fast, Griffin replied dryly. What can I do for you, Reed? I was passing by and thought I'd check on my investment. Reed set his gaze moving past Griffin to take in the cabin's interior. When his eyes landed on Eleanor holding Henry, his bushy eyebrows rose. I see you've acquired help. Miss Harlow is the new school teacher for Willow Creek, Griffin explained, not inviting the banker inside. She's been kind enough to assist while I recover. Reed's expression was skeptical. How convenient. He returned his attention to Griffin. I trust your injury won't affect your ability to make your payment. The deadline is approaching, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm aware, Griffin said, his voice tight. And I'll have your money. Reed smiled without warmth. I certainly hope so. It would be a shame if these children had to be uprooted because their father couldn't meet his obligations. Eleanor stepped forward, her green eyes flashing with indignation. Mr. McAllister is recovering from a serious injury, Mr. Reed. Surely the bank can extend some grace given the circumstances. Reed turned his cold gaze on Eleanor. And you are Eleanor Harlow, she replied, her chin lifting slightly. As Mr. McAllister mentioned, I'm the new school teacher. Ah, yes, the school board mentioned hiring someone from back east. Reed studied her with new interest. Harlow, any relation to Jonathan Winters by chance? There's a resemblance. Eleanor stiffened visibly. He was my brother. I see. Reed's expression was unreadable. A troubled young man. Such a shame about his end. The tension in the room was palpable. Griffin moved slightly, positioning himself between Reed and Eleanor. Is there anything else you needed, Reed? He asked pointedly. The banker smiled thinly. Not at present. Just remember McAllister, $300 by the end of August, or this property becomes bank property. He tipped his hat. Good day to you both. After Reed departed, Griffin closed the door and turned to find Eleanor still standing rigidly, her face pale. Henry had begun to fuss in her arms, sensing her tension. Are you all right? Griffin asked gently. Eleanor seemed to shake herself from whatever dark thoughts had gripped her. Yes, I'm fine. I didn't expect him to mention Johnny. She focused on soothing Henry. That man is despicable, threatening you while you're injured. Reed wants this land, Griffin explained, returning to the table. Has for years. The railroad's coming through and property values will soar. He's just waiting for an excuse to foreclose. Eleanor sat across from him, bouncing Henry gently on her knee. Will you be able to make the payment? Griffin ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he'd developed since Margaret's death. Honestly, I don't know. With the doctor's bills and me unable to work the fields properly. He trailed off, unwilling to voice the full extent of his fears. What happens if you can't pay? Eleanor asked quietly. Reed takes the ranch. The children and I. Griffin swallowed hard. I don't know. Start over somewhere, I suppose, if we can stay together. Eleanor's expression grew determined. That won't happen. We'll find a way. We, Griffin repeated, surprised by her inclusion of herself in his problems. Yes, we, Eleanor affirmed. I'm not about to stand by and watch these children lose their home after they have already lost their mother. The fierceness of her declaration touched something in Griffin's heart that had been dormant since Margaret's death. Before he could respond, Charlotte wandered in from the bedroom, her perceptive gaze moving between the adults. Is the bad man gone? She asked, climbing onto Griffin's lap. Yes, sweetheart, Griffin assured her, kissing the top of her head. He's gone. Charlotte leaned against his chest, then looked up at Eleanor. Livia will help us, Papa. Mama said so in my dream. Eleanor's eyes met Griffin's over Charlotte's head, and something unspoken passed between them. Whatever secrets Eleanor Harlow might be hiding, whatever had brought her to his door that fateful day with a loaf of bread, Griffin found himself believing in her promise. Somehow they would find a way through this crisis together. That night, after the children were asleep, Griffin found Eleanor sitting alone on the porch, staring up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. She had taken to sleeping in the small storage room he'd been converting into a bedroom for the twins, insisting she was comfortable there despite its cramped quarters. May I join you? He asked softly. Eleanor nodded, making room for him on the bench. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. The stars are different here, Eleanor finally said. Brighter somehow. In Boston, the city lights dimmed them. Margaret used to say that God hung extra stars in the western sky to guide pioneers home. Griffin replied, the memory bringing a sad smile to his face. Eleanor glanced at him. You loved her very much. With everything I had, Griffin confirmed. Her death, it nearly destroyed me. If not for the children. They're your anchors, Eleanor observed. They keep you tethered to life when grief might otherwise sweep you away. The insight struck Griffin as remarkably perceptive. Yes, exactly. You speak as though from experience. Eleanor's gaze returned to the stars. I lost everyone I loved in one night, my parents to the fire, and in many ways my brother too. Johnny was never the same afterward. The guilt consumed him. Guilt, Griffin prompted gently. He blamed himself for not being home that night, for not saving them, Eleanor explained. He was studying late at the university. I was staying with a friend. Our parents died alone. Griffin recognized the pain of survivor's guilt. He'd seen it in too many soldiers' eyes during the war, had felt it himself when Margaret died, while he was away, seeking help. It wasn't your fault, he said quietly. Either's of you. I know that now, Eleanor replied. But Johnny never did. He carried that guilt with him, and it colored every decision he made afterward, including coming west. Griffin sensed they were approaching whatever connection existed between Eleanor's brother and his family. And you followed him here. Eleanor nodded slowly. I needed to find him to understand what happened. She turned to face Griffin, her expression resolute. There's something I should tell you, something about why I'm really here. The sound of crying from inside the cabin interrupted her. Baby Henry's distinctive wail rose above the night sounds. Eleanor rose immediately. I should check on him. Eleanor, Griffin called as she reached the door. Whatever it is, we can talk tomorrow. She paused, her silhouette framed in the doorway. Yes, tomorrow, she agreed, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't certain the conversation would ever take place. As Griffin remained on the porch contemplating the stars his wife had so loved, he found himself increasingly curious about Eleanor Harlow and the secrets she carried. Wilson had implied that there was a connection between Eleanor's brother and Griffin's family. But what could it possibly be? Jonathan Winters had apparently come to Wyoming and died before Griffin had ever heard his name. Yet Eleanor had appeared at precisely the moment Griffin needed help most, as if guided by some invisible hand. Charlotte's insistence that her mother had sent Livia in a dream was childish fancy, of course, but Griffin couldn't deny the strange sense that Eleanor's arrival had been somehow meant to be. What he couldn't yet determine was whether that was a blessing or a complication he wasn't prepared to face. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the Wyoming summer heat already building as the sun crested the eastern hills. Eleanor rose early, as had become her habit since arriving at the McAllister Ranch, to start breakfast before the children awoke. She found Griffin already up, attempting to milk one of the cows, one-handed, his injured arm held awkwardly against his side. Mr. McAllister, she chided, setting down her water bucket. Dr. Wilson specifically said you weren't to strain that arm. Griffin looked up with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. The cows won't milk themselves, he said. And please, after all this time, I think you can call me Griffin. Eleanor approached, taking the milk pail from him. Griffin, then, and I'm perfectly capable of milking cows. I may have grown up in Boston, but I spent summers on my uncle's farm in Vermont. Griffin reluctantly relinquished his position on the milking stool. Is there anything you can't do, Miss Harlow? Eleanor, she corrected with a small smile. And plenty, I assure you. My bread is passable, but my pies are dreadful. This drew a chuckle from Griffin, a sound Eleanor realized she hadn't heard before. It transformed his face, softening the lines of worry and grief that had seemed permanently etched there. Margaret's pies were legendary, he said, the memory bringing warmth rather than pain to his voice. The whole church would request them for socials. Eleanor positioned herself on the stool and began milking with practiced hands. Tell me about her, she said softly, if you don't mind. Griffin was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. Margaret was sunshine. That's the best way I can describe her. She lit up every room she entered. We met at a church picnic in Illinois before the war. I was 19, she was 17. Her father didn't approve of me, thought I was too rough around the edges, but Margaret saw something worth loving. Eleanor kept her hands moving steadily, providing Griffin the space to continue his story without the pressure of her gaze. After the war, we came west. Margaret had this dream of building something that was entirely ours, a place where our children could run free under open skies. She never complained about the hardships, even when our first cabin leaked during rainstorms, or when the crops failed that second year. His voice caught slightly. She was the strongest person I've ever known until she got sick, Eleanor finished gently when he trailed off. Griffin nodded, his eyes distant with memory. It happened so quickly. One day she was fine tending the garden with Charlotte on her hip and Henry growing inside her. The next she was in labor early, burning with fever. The birth was difficult, but she rallied afterward. I thought the worst was behind us. Then the cholera symptoms appeared. Eleanor's hands stilled on the cow's udder, her heart racing. This was the moment she'd been dreading and seeking since arriving in Wyoming. Was there a doctor? She asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. A young one newly arrived in Willow Creek, Griffin said. Dr. Wilson was away delivering a baby when Margaret took ill. This new doctor, he seemed confident, but he shook his head. He prescribed medicines that didn't help. By the time Dr. Wilson returned 3 days later, Margaret was beyond saving. She died holding baby Henry with the other children gathered around her bed. Eleanor felt ill, the description matching exactly what she had feared. This doctor, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you remember his name? Winters, Griffin replied, oblivious to Eleanor's distress. Jonathan Winters. He left town shortly after Margaret died. Dr. Wilson said later that he took her death particularly hard, blamed himself even though there was likely nothing anyone could have done. Eleanor resumed milking, hoping Griffin wouldn't notice how her hands trembled. I'm so sorry, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Before Griffin could respond, the twins burst into the barn, their identical faces alight with mischief. Pa, Miss Eleanor, come quick, Luke exclaimed. There's a fox trying to get the chickens. Griffin straightened immediately. Where? By the coop, Matthew supplied. He's big and red and scary. Eleanor handed the milk pail to Griffin. I'll check on it. You stay with the children. Without waiting for his response, she hurried out of the barn, grateful for the interruption that allowed her to escape the conversation. The fox, a young scrawny thing, scampered away at her approach, having been more curious than truly threatening to the well-protected chickens. Eleanor stood by the chicken coop long after the fox had disappeared, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Her suspicions had been confirmed in the worst possible way. Jonathan, her brilliant, sensitive, troubled brother, had been the doctor who failed to save Margaret McAllister. The connection she had feared existed between her family and Griffin's was real and far more direct than she had imagined. How could she possibly tell Griffin now? How could she explain that she had come to Wyoming partly to find her brother and partly to understand what had happened with his last patient? A patient who turned out to be Griffin's beloved wife. The sound of small footsteps approaching interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte appeared at her side, a doll made from corn husks clutched in her arms. The fox is gone, Eleanor told her, forcing a smile. Everything's all right. Charlotte studied Eleanor with those unnervingly perceptive blue eyes. You're sad, she said simply. Eleanor knelt to the child's level. A little, she admitted. Sometimes grown-ups get sad about things that happened long ago. Charlotte nodded as if this made perfect sense. Like Papa gets sad about Mama. Yes, like that. The little girl held out her doll. Lucy helps me when I'm sad. You can hold her if you want. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the innocent gesture. Thank you, sweetheart, she said, carefully taking the doll. That's very kind of you. Charlotte watched as Eleanor cradled the doll, then said, Mama says it's okay to be sad sometimes, but we have to remember to be happy too. Your mama sounds very wise, Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. She is, Charlotte agreed matter-of-factly. She's watching us from heaven. That's why she could send you to help when Papa got hurt. Before Eleanor could formulate a response to this declaration, Griffin appeared carrying Henry and trailed by the twins. Fox all gone, he asked, scanning the area. Eleanor nodded, rising to her feet and handing the doll back to Charlotte. Just a young one, more curious than dangerous. The chickens are fine. Griffin's gaze lingered on her face, and Eleanor wondered if her emotional turmoil was visible. Are you all right? He asked quietly. You look troubled. I'm fine, she assured him, brushing dust from her skirt. Just thinking about what you told me earlier. Understanding crossed Griffin's features. I'm sorry if I upset you with talk of Margaret's passing. No, not at all, Eleanor said quickly. It's just, I understand loss, that's all. Griffin seemed about to press the issue when baby Henry began to fuss. Eleanor reached for him immediately, grateful for the distraction. He's probably hungry. I'll take him inside and prepare his bottle. As she cradled Henry against her chest and headed toward the cabin, Eleanor could feel Griffin's gaze following her. The weight of her unspoken truth pressed down on her shoulders, making each step feel heavier than the last. She had come to Wyoming seeking answers and perhaps absolution for her brother, but she had never anticipated becoming so deeply involved with the very family Jonathan's mistake had devastated. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to make amends for her brother's failure to save Margaret McAllister, Eleanor had inadvertently become a surrogate mother to the woman's children. And worst of all, he was beginning to develop feelings for the widower, left behind feelings that would surely wither and die the moment Griffin learned who she really was and why she had come. As the days passed, Griffin found himself increasingly intrigued by the enigmatic Eleanor Harlow. She moved through his home with quiet efficiency, transforming chaos into order, without seeming to exert effort. The children adored her, particularly Charlotte, who followed Eleanor like a devoted shadow. Yet despite her growing comfort with the family, Griffin sensed Eleanor was holding something back. Occasionally he would find her standing before Margaret's portrait, her expression unreadable. Other times she would fall into pensive silences, only to startle when addressed as though her thoughts had carried her far away. Dr. Wilson's cryptic comments about Eleanor's connection to Jonathan Winters and her brother's mistake with a patient lingered in Griffin's mind. He had planned to ask Eleanor directly about it that night on the porch before Henry's crying interrupted them. Since then, the right moment hadn't presented itself, or perhaps Griffin had avoided creating such a moment, fearing what he might learn. A week after Mason Reed's unwelcome visit, Griffin's arm had improved enough for light work. He sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor after the children were asleep discussing the ranch's finances. Even if I can get the north field planted next week, the crop won't yield enough in time to make Reed's payment, Griffin said, running calculations for the dozenth time. I could sell one of the milk cows, but that would only bring in $50 at most. What about driving some cattle to the railhead at Cheyenne, Eleanor suggested. Mrs. Patterson mentioned other ranchers doing that. Griffin shook his head. I'd need to be gone for at least 2 weeks. I can't leave you alone with the children that long, and the drive would certainly re-injure my arm. Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. There must be something of value that could be sold. Nothing I haven't already considered, Griffin replied heavily. Margaret's jewelry went to pay for her funeral and Henry's birth. The extra horse was sold last winter when food ran low. This land and what's on it is all we have left. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to touch the cameo brooch at her collar, the one personal adornment she wore daily. Griffin had noticed her habit of touching it when deep in thought, as though it connected her to some inner source of strength. What about a loan from someone other than Reed, she asked. In Willow Creek, Reed owns the only bank within 50 miles. Anyone with money to lend is already in business with him. Griffin sighed, pushing the paper away. I appreciate your concern, Eleanor, but I've been fighting this battle since Margaret died. Some fights can't be won. I refuse to believe that, Eleanor said firmly. There's always a solution if you look hard enough. Griffin studied her determined expression illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp. Why do you care so much about what happens to us? You've already done more than anyone could expect, staying to help after the snake bite. But this, he gestured to the financial papers spread between them. This isn't your burden to bear. Eleanor's hands stilled on her brooch, her green eyes meeting his directly. Perhaps I believe that helping others is never a burden, but a privilege. That's a noble sentiment, Griffin acknowledged. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Dr. Wilson hinted that you came to Wyoming for specific reasons related to your brother. A flash of alarm crossed Eleanor's features before she composed herself. Yes, I came looking for Johnny. I didn't know that he was gone until I arrived. And what connection did your brother have to my family? Griffin pressed gently. Dr. Wilson implied there was one. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers worrying the edge of one of the papers. It's complicated. Eleanor, Griffin said softly, whatever it is, I'd rather hear it from you than piece it together from town gossip. She took a deep breath, then raised her eyes to his once more. Johnny was the doctor who treated your wife during her final illness. Though Griffin had suspected as much from their previous conversation, having it confirmed still sent a jolt through him. You knew this when you arrived at my farm. Not exactly, Eleanor said carefully. I knew Johnny had been involved with a case that went badly, a young mother who died of cholera shortly after childbirth. I didn't know it was your wife until I saw her portrait and realized the timing matched what Johnny had written in his journals. Griffin sat back processing this information. So when you arrived that day with the bread, I was genuinely coming to introduce myself at Mrs. Vaughn's. Patterson's suggestion, Eleanor insisted, finding you bitten by a snake was pure coincidence. But once I realized who you were, she hesitated. I felt I had to stay to help if I could, to understand what happened to Johnny, and perhaps in some small way make amends for his failure. The pieces began to fit together in Griffin's mind: Eleanor's medical knowledge, her instant connection with the children, her determination to save the ranch. It wasn't just kindness motivating her, it was a form of atonement. Your brother's mistake wasn't your responsibility, Griffin said, surprised to find no anger in his heart, only a strange sense of things coming full circle. He was my little brother, Eleanor replied, her voice catching. After our parents died, I practically raised him. I encouraged him to pursue medicine when he wanted to quit. If I had been more attentive, recognized the signs of his distress sooner. She shook her head. Johnny was brilliant but fragile. Margaret's death broke something in him. He left a note saying he couldn't live with the knowledge that his inexperience had cost a mother's life. Griffin's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. He had harbored resentment toward the young doctor who had failed to save Margaret, but he had never wished him such a tragic end. I'm sorry, he said simply, for your loss as well as my own. Eleanor looked up in surprise, clearly having expected recrimination rather than sympathy. You're not angry. What good would anger do now? Griffin asked. Margaret is gone. Your brother is gone. Being angry won't change either of those facts. He reached across the table to cover her hand with his. And without you, I might have left my children orphaned from a snake bite. Perhaps there's a kind of balance in that. Eleanor turned her hand to clasp his, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I was so afraid to tell you, she admitted. Afraid you'd send me away, that the children would think I'd betrayed them somehow. The children adore you, Griffin assured her. As for sending you away, he squeezed her hand gently. I can't imagine this place without you now. The admission surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Eleanor. Her cheeks flushed, and she withdrew her hand, though not before Griffin felt her briefly return the pressure of his fingers. It's getting late, she said, rising from the table. We should both get some rest. Griffin nodded, recognizing her need for space after such a revelation. Eleanor, he called as she reached the door to her small room. Thank you for telling me the truth. She paused her back to him. I should have told you sooner. You told me when the time was right, Griffin replied. That's what matters. After Eleanor disappeared into her room, Griffin remained at the table, contemplating all he had learned. He had expected to feel betrayed or manipulated upon discovering Eleanor's connection to Jonathan Winters, but instead he felt only a deeper appreciation for the courage it must have taken her to face the family her brother had inadvertently harmed. And if he were completely honest with himself, he would have to admit that his feelings for Eleanor Harlow had grown beyond gratitude or friendship. Somewhere amid the daily rhythms of caring for children and tending the ranch together, amid their evening conversations on the porch and shared laughter over the twins' antics, Griffin had begun to care for Eleanor in a way he hadn't thought possible after losing Margaret. The realization both exhilarated and terrified him. Was it a betrayal of Margaret's memory to feel this way so soon? And even if it wasn't, what future could there be for them when Eleanor would soon return to her teaching position in town, and Griffin might well lose the ranch to Mason Reed? These thoughts chased each other through Griffin's mind as he finally retired to his own bed, the financial papers still scattered across the kitchen table like harbingers of doom that no amount of newfound emotional clarity could dispel. The following morning, Eleanor woke with a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced since arriving in Wyoming. Revealing the truth about her connection to the McAllister family had been terrifying, but Griffin's compassionate response had lifted a weight from her shoulders. For the first time, she could look at the children without a shadow of guilt darkening her affection for them. Her relief was short-lived, however. As she emerged from her room, she found Griffin standing at the window, his posture tense. What is it? She asked, immediately concerned. Reed, Griffin replied grimly, and he's brought company. Eleanor joined him at the window. Mason Reed sat astride a fine bay horse accompanied by two men she didn't recognize. One wore a badge that caught the morning sunlight, the town sheriff. Why would he bring the sheriff? Eleanor asked, her stomach nodding with apprehension. To make it official, I suppose, Griffin said, his voice flat. Wait here with the children. I'll handle this. Eleanor caught his arm as he turned toward the door. I'm coming with you. Griffin hesitated, then nodded. All right, but let me do the talking. They stepped onto the porch together as Reed and his companions dismounted. The banker's smug expression sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "McAllister," Reed called in greeting. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Miss Harlow?" He tipped his hat in Eleanor's direction, his smile not reaching his eyes. "What can I do for you, Reed?" Griffin asked, making no effort to hide his displeasure at the uninvited visit. Reed gestured to the man wearing the badge. "You know Sheriff Taylor, I believe. And this is Mr. Daniels, a representative of the railroad company." Griffin nodded curtly to both men. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, looked uncomfortable. Daniels, by contrast, surveyed the property with the calculating eye of someone assessing a potential purchase. "We've come to discuss your situation," Reed continued smoothly. "I've been reviewing your loan and I'm afraid the outlook isn't promising. Given your injury and the unlikelihood of you meeting the payment deadline, the bank is prepared to initiate foreclosure proceedings immediately." "The payment isn't due for another 6 weeks," Griffin protested. "You can't foreclose before then." Reed produced a document from his jacket pocket. "Actually, according to the terms of your loan, the bank can call for immediate payment if there's reason to believe the borrower will default. Your injury constitutes such a reason." "That's outrageous," Eleanor interjected, unable to remain silent. Reed turned his cold gaze on her. "Business, Miss Harlow, not personal. The bank must protect its investments." Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mason, maybe we could give McAllister a little more time considering the circumstances." "The circumstances are precisely why we must act now," Reed replied sharply. "McAllister can't work the land properly with his injury. The property will only deteriorate, further reducing its value." "Its value to whom?" Eleanor demanded. "To the railroad, perhaps." She nodded toward Daniels, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. Reed's expression hardened. "The future use of the property is not your concern, Miss Harlow. It is my concern when you're trying to steal a home from 4 young children who've already lost their mother." Eleanor retorted, her voice rising with indignation. Griffin placed a restraining hand on Eleanor's arm. "What exactly are you proposing, Reed?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Reed smiled thinly. "The bank is prepared to forgive the outstanding loan in exchange for immediate possession of the property. You would have 2 weeks to vacate, and we would provide $25 to assist with your relocation." "$25?" Eleanor exclaimed incredulously. "This ranch is worth 10 times what you loaned Mr. McAllister, and you know it." "The railroad has expressed interest in the land," Reed acknowledged, "but that's a separate matter from the loan." Griffin's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse your generous offer, then the bank will foreclose in 6 weeks as originally planned, and you'll receive nothing," Reed said with a shrug. "The choice is yours, McAllister. Something or nothing." Eleanor felt Griffin's muscles tense beneath her hand. She could sense his rage barely contained beneath his outward composure. "I'll need time to consider," Griffin said finally. Reed nodded magnanimously. "Of course, you have until tomorrow. The sheriff will return then for your answer." He tipped his hat again. "Good day to you both." As the 3 men remounted and rode away, Eleanor turned to Griffin, expecting to find him defeated. Instead, his blue eyes burned with a fierce determination she hadn't seen before. "We have 1 day to find a solution," he said, his voice low and intense. "1 day to save our home." Our home. The phrase sent a flutter through Eleanor's heart despite the dire circumstances. "We'll find a way," she promised. "Together." Before Griffin could respond, Charlotte appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Papa? Who were those men?" Griffin's expression softened as he knelt to his daughter's level. "Just some business visitors, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." Charlotte looked unconvinced. "The man with the gray beard is bad," she stated with childlike certainty. "He wants to take our house." Griffin and Eleanor exchanged startled glances. Charlotte had been asleep when Reed arrived. There was no way she could have heard their conversation. "Why do you say that, Charlotte?" Eleanor asked gently. The little girl shrugged. "I saw him in my dream. Mama was crying because he wanted to take our house away." Griffin gathered Charlotte into his arms, holding her close. "No one is taking him our house," he assured her with more confidence than Eleanor knew he felt. "I promise." Over Charlotte's head, Griffin's eyes met Eleanor's, a silent communication passing between them. They needed a miracle, and they had less than 24 hours to find one. After breakfast, when the children were occupied with their chores and play, Griffin and Eleanor reconvened at the kitchen table to formulate a plan. We need to consider all possibilities, Eleanor said, determined to approach the problem methodically. Is there anyone in town who might lend you the money? Griffin shook his head. I've exhausted all those options already. Anyone with money to lend is either in Reed's pocket or has already refused me. What about selling part of the land instead of all of it? Eleanor suggested. Enough to pay off Reed but keep the house and some acreage. Reed wants the entire property for the railroad, Griffin explained. It's the location that matters. The planned track would run right through where we're sitting now. Eleanor bit her lip in frustration. There must be something valuable enough to raise $300 quickly. A thoughtful expression crossed Griffin's face. There might be one thing, he said slowly, but it's a long shot. What is it? Eleanor asked eagerly. Before the war, my father was a prospector in California, Griffin explained. He never struck it rich, but he did find one small gold nugget. He had it made into a pocket watch for me when I enlisted. I've kept it as a family heirloom, planned to give it to the twins when they were grown. He ran a hand through his hair. I've never had it appraised, but it might be worth something. Where is it? Eleanor asked. Hidden in a loose floorboard in my bedroom, Griffin replied. I didn't want Reed to know about it in case it came to this. We should take it to be appraised immediately, Eleanor said, hope kindling within her. If it's valuable enough, we could pay off Reed and keep the ranch. Griffin nodded, though his expression remained troubled. It feels wrong to sell something meant for my sons, but losing the ranch would be worse. Much worse, Eleanor agreed softly. This is their home, their heritage. The watch is just an object. Griffin rose from the table. I'll retrieve it now. We can ride into town while the children nap. Mrs. Patterson returned yesterday. She can watch them for a few hours. As Griffin disappeared into his bedroom, Eleanor found herself offering a silent prayer that this last-ditch effort would succeed. The thought of the McAllister family being forced from their home was unbearable, not just for the practical hardship it would cause, but for the emotional toll it would take. This land was the last connection the children had to their mother. This house held all their memories of her. Griffin returned holding a worn leather pouch. Here it is, he said, opening the pouch to reveal an ornate gold pocket watch. The case was intricately engraved with a mountain scene, and when Griffin pressed the latch, it opened to show a clock face with Roman numerals. Inside the lid was an inscription, "To my son Griffin, may time be your ally in war and peace." It's beautiful, Eleanor said sincerely. Your father had excellent taste. He was a dreamer, Griffin replied with a sad smile. Always chasing the next big strike, never quite finding it. But he was a good man. He would understand using this to save the ranch. They arranged for Mrs. Patterson to watch the children, explaining they had urgent business in town. The older woman agreed readily, though her shrewd eyes suggested she suspected there was more to the story than they were telling. The ride to Willow Creek took just over an hour, Griffin and Eleanor maintaining a brisk pace. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them in town. Eleanor found herself studying Griffin's profile as they rode side by side, noting the strength in his jaw, the determination in his eyes. He was a man who had already endured more than his share of hardship, yet he refused to surrender to despair. In that moment, Eleanor realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with Griffin McAllister. The recognition both elated and terrified her. Even if they managed to save the ranch, what future could there be for them? She was scheduled to begin teaching in less than 3 weeks. Griffin would remain at the ranch with his children. And however compassionate he had been about her connection to Jonathan, that shadow would always exist between them. Willow Creek appeared on the horizon, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley. The town had grown in recent years, boosted by the promise of the railroad's arrival, but it was still small enough that two strangers riding in together would attract notice. They headed directly to the assayer's office, a small building near the bank. The assayer, a bespectacled man named Morris, greeted them with professional courtesy. "What can I do for you folks today?" he asked, eyeing the leather pouch Griffin placed on the counter. "I need to know the value of this watch," Griffin explained, removing the timepiece from its pouch, specifically the gold content. Morris took the watch, examining it with a practiced eye. He opened the case, checked the mechanisms, then weighed it on a small scale. "Fine craftsmanship again," he commented. "California gold, I'd guess, from the color. The case is solid gold, though the inner workings are standard. He made some calculations on a piece of paper. As a timepiece, it's worth perhaps $75 to a collector who appreciates the artistry. For the gold alone melted down about $60. Eleanor's heart sank. $60 was far short of the $300 they needed. "You're certain?" Griffin asked, his disappointment evident, despite his effort to hide it. Morris nodded. "I could put you in touch with a collector in Cheyenne who might pay more, but that would take time." "Time we don't have," Griffin said, returning the watch to its pouch. "Thank you for your assessment." As they left the assayer's office, Eleanor could feel Griffin's spirits plummeting. "We'll think of something else," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Griffin shook his head. "There is nothing else, Eleanor. The watch was my last hope." They stood on the boardwalk, the busy street before them, uncertain of their next move. Eleanor was about to suggest they visit Dr. Wilson for advice when a familiar voice called out, "McAllister, Miss Harlow." They turned to see Mason Reed emerging from the bank across the street, his expression one of calculated surprise. "What brings you to town?" Reed asked as he approached, his tone falsely cordial. "Considering my offer, I hope." "Just some errands," Griffin replied, noncommittally. Reed's gaze shifted to the leather pouch in Griffin's hand. "Ah, selling family treasures to raise funds. A noble but futile gesture, I fear." His smile was like a predator's. "My offer stands until tomorrow, McAllister. I suggest you take it while you can." Eleanor felt a surge of anger at the banker's smug certainty. "Mr. McAllister hasn't made his decision yet," she said coldly. "And I believe your offer was grossly inadequate given the true value of the property." Reed's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "The property is worth what someone is willing to pay for it, Miss Harlow. Economics, not sentiment, determines value." Before Eleanor could retort, Griffin placed a restraining hand on her arm. "We'll see you tomorrow, Reed," he said evenly. "Good day." As Reed tipped his hat and sauntered away, Eleanor turned to Griffin. "That man is despicable," she fumed, "using your injury as an excuse to steal your land." "He's a businessman," Griffin replied wearily. "An unscrupulous one, but he's just doing what men like him have always done, taking advantage of others' misfortunes." They began walking toward the livery stable to retrieve their horses, the weight of their failed mission hanging heavy between them. As they passed the general store, Eleanor paused, a thought suddenly occurring to her. "Wait here," she said to Griffin. "I need to check something." Inside the store, Eleanor approached the proprietor, Mr. Davis, who greeted her warmly. "Miss Harlow, excited for school to start soon? The children have been asking when their new teacher will begin." "I'm looking forward to it," Eleanor replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Davis, I have a somewhat unusual question. Do you buy jewelry?" Davis raised his bushy eyebrows. "Occasionally, if it's something my wife might like or that I could resell." "Why do you ask?" Eleanor reached up to unfasten the cameo brooch at her collar, the one possession she had kept from her life in Boston, a gift from her mother on her 16th birthday. The cameo featured a delicately carved profile of a woman set in a gold frame with small seed pearls around the border. "I'm interested in selling this," she said, placing the brooch on the counter. Davis picked up the piece, examining it closely. "This is very fine work," he said appreciatively. "European, I'd guess. The gold alone is valuable, and the craftsmanship is exceptional." "What would you offer for it?" Eleanor asked, steeling herself against the pang of loss she felt at the thought of parting with her mother's gift. Davis considered for a moment. "I could give you $120. It's worth more, but that's all the cash I have on hand." Eleanor's heart quickened. $120 combined with the $60 from Griffin's watch would bring them to $180, still short of the $300 they needed, but much closer. "I'll take it," she said decisively. Davis looked surprised. "Are you certain this seems like a family piece?" "I'm certain," Eleanor replied, though her throat tightened as she watched Davis count out the money. When she emerged from the store, Griffin was waiting anxiously. "What was that about?" he asked. Eleanor held out the money. $120, she said simply. "For my brooch." Griffin's eyes widened in shock. "Your cameo, Eleanor, no. I've seen how you treasure it." "It's just a thing," she said, echoing his earlier words about the watch. "The ranch is your children's future." Griffin stared at the money in her hand, then at her face, his expression a mixture of gratitude and distress. "I can't accept this sacrifice from you." "It's not a sacrifice if it's freely given," Eleanor insisted. Please, Griffin, let me help. After a long moment, Griffin nodded, accepting the money with visible emotion. Thank you, he said hoarsely. I don't know how to repay such generosity. There's nothing to repay, Eleanor assured him. Now let's see if we can raise the rest somehow. They continued toward the livery stable, discussing potential sources for the remaining $120 they needed. Eleanor suggested asking Dr. Wilson if he knew anyone who might lend them the money, while Griffin wondered if he could sell one of his horses, despite the impact it would have on the ranch's operations. As they neared the stable, they noticed a crowd gathered outside the saloon across the street. A commotion was underway. Raised voices, the sound of furniture being moved, and then a cheer went up from the onlookers. What's happening? Eleanor asked a passerby. Wrestling match, the man replied excitedly. Traveling champion, offering $50 to anyone who can pin him. Nobody's managed it yet. Griffin and Eleanor exchanged glances. $50, Griffin murmured thoughtfully. You're not considering it, Eleanor said, alarm rising within her. Your arm hasn't fully healed. It's healed enough, Griffin replied, a determined glint in his eye. And $50 would get us that much closer. It's too risky, Eleanor protested. If you re-injure yourself, you won't be able to work the ranch at all. But Griffin was already moving toward the saloon, drawn by the prospect of adding to their growing fund. Eleanor followed reluctantly, concerned but understanding his desperation. Inside the saloon, tables had been pushed aside to create a makeshift ring. In the center stood a mountain of a man, bare-chested and glistening with sweat, his massive arms raised in victory over a defeated opponent who was being helped to his feet by friends. Another challenger, the giant bellowed. $50 to ye man who can pin me. Griffin stepped forward, removing his jacket despite Eleanor's whispered protests. I'll take that challenge, he called, his voice carrying over the crowd's murmur. The champion turned, eyeing Griffin with amusement. A bit lean for wrestling, aren't you, friend? Don't let that fool you, Griffin replied, rolling up his sleeves to reveal arms corded with muscle from years of ranch work. He was careful to hide the still-healing snakebite. The crowd parted to let Griffin enter the makeshift ring. Eleanor hung back her heart in her throat as the two men circled each other. The champion was taller by several inches and outweighed Griffin by at least 50 pounds, his barrel chest and thick arms speaking of a lifetime of physical power. But as the match began, Eleanor saw that Griffin had advantages of his own. He was quicker, more agile, and seemed to anticipate his opponent's moves with uncanny accuracy. He dodged the champion's initial rush, sidestepped a powerful grab, and managed to dart behind the larger man to seize him around the waist. The crowd roared its approval as Griffin executed a skillful throw, momentarily catching the champion off balance. But the larger man recovered quickly, countering with a move that sent Griffin sprawling. Eleanor gasped as she saw Griffin land hard on his injured arm. For a moment, Griffin lay still, and Eleanor feared he had been seriously hurt. But then he rolled to his feet, a grimace of pain crossing his face before he mastered it. The champion charged again, and this time Griffin met him head-on, using the larger man's momentum against him, in a move that Eleanor recognized from battlefield triage, something soldiers had taught each other during the war. The champion went down heavily, and Griffin followed, attempting to secure a pin. For several breathless seconds, it seemed he might succeed. Then the champion bucked powerfully, throwing Griffin off and reversing their positions in one fluid movement. With a triumphant roar, the champion pinned Griffin's shoulders to the floor, the referee counting to 3 before declaring the match over. The crowd groaned in disappointment. They had been rooting for the local underdog against the traveling champion. Griffin rose slowly, his disappointment evident despite his sportsman-like handshake with the victor. As he made his way back to Eleanor, she could see he was favoring his injured arm. Let me see, she demanded once they were outside, pulling him into the alley beside the saloon. Griffin reluctantly allowed her to examine his arm. The wound had not reopened, but the area was swollen and bruised from the impact. You're fortunate it's not worse, Eleanor scolded, though her voice was gentle. That was reckless, Griffin. It was worth the risk, he replied stubbornly. I nearly had him. Nearly doesn't pay, Reed, Eleanor pointed out, and now your arm will take even longer to heal properly. Griffin sighed, acknowledging the truth of her words. I just thought, if I could add $50 to what we already have. We'll find another way, Eleanor assured him, though her confidence was waning. They had raised $180 between them, a substantial sum, but still $120 short of what they needed. As they continued toward the livery stable, both lost in thought about their next move, they passed the telegraph office. A sign in the window caught Eleanor's attention. Urgent telegraph operator needed for 1 week, $20 payment upon completion. Wait, Eleanor said, tugging Griffin's sleeve. Look at that. Griffin read the sign, then shook his head. $25 isn't enough to make a difference, and neither of us knows telegraph code. I do, Eleanor replied quietly. My father insisted I learn said it might be useful someday. Griffin stared at her in surprise. You never mentioned that. It never came up, Eleanor said with a small shrug. But if I could work here for a week, that's another $25 toward our goal. But the children, Mrs. Patterson could help during the day, Eleanor suggested, and I could return to the ranch each evening. It's not ideal, but it's something. Griffin's expression softened as he gazed at her. You continue to amaze me, Eleanor Harlow. Every time I think I know you, you reveal some new facet of yourself. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under his admiring gaze. Shall we inquire about the position? Inside the telegraph office, they found the manager, Mr. Collins, in a state of agitation. His regular operator had left suddenly to care for an ailing parent, leaving him short-handed during a busy period. You can operate a telegraph, Miss Harlow, he asked skeptically when Eleanor inquired about the position. Yes, Mr. Collins, my father insisted I learn. She demonstrated her proficiency by tapping out a quick message on the silent key. Collins's eyebrows rose in surprise. Well, that's correct Morse code, and your timing is precise. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. I need someone to start immediately. The job would be from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening for the next week. $25 upon completion. I can begin tomorrow, Eleanor offered, but I would need to return to the McAllister ranch each evening. Collins glanced between Eleanor and Griffin, a knowing look crossing his face. I see. Well, I suppose that could be arranged. The evening traffic is lighter anyway. They shook hands on the agreement, and Eleanor felt a small surge of satisfaction. Another $25 would bring their total to $205, still short, but they were making progress. As they finally reached the livery stable and prepared to ride back to the ranch, Griffin turned to Eleanor, his expression serious. You've already done so much, he said quietly. Bawling your brooch, taking this telegraph job. I can't ask for more. You didn't ask, Eleanor reminded him. I offered. Griffin took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. Why, Eleanor? Why go to such lengths for us? Eleanor met his gaze steadily, knowing she could no longer hide the truth in her heart. Because somewhere along the way, your family became important to me. More important than I ever expected. And she took a deep breath. Because I care for you, Griffin. For you and your children. Griffin's blue eyes darkened with emotion. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might pull her into his arms. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. We will find a way, he promised, his voice husky with feeling. Together. As they rode back toward the ranch, the weight of their predicament still hung heavy between them, but it was now balanced by something else, a fragile hope born of shared purpose and deepening affection. They had $180 with another $25 promised. They still needed nearly 100 more, and less than 24 hours remained before Reed would demand Griffin's answer. But for the first time since Reed's ultimatum, Eleanor truly believed they might find a solution. Not because the path forward was clear, it wasn't, but because they would face whatever came next, side by side. Evening shadows stretched across the land as Griffin and Eleanor rode back to the McAllister ranch. The weight of their situation hung between them, tempered by the small victories of the day. $180 raised with another $25 promised substantial progress, but still nearly $100 short of what they needed to save the ranch. Charlotte was the first to spot them approaching. She raced from the porch where she'd been sitting with Mrs. Patterson, her blonde curl bouncing as she ran to meet them. Papa, Miss Eleanor, she called, her small face alight with excitement. Did you bring something from town? Griffin dismounted carefully, favoring his newly bruised arm as he swept Charlotte up with his good one. Just ourselves, sweetheart, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Mrs. Patterson followed at a more sedate pace, baby Henry balanced on her hip. Everything go all right in town? She asked, her shrewd eyes taking in Griffin's stiff movements in the absence of Eleanor's cameo brooch. As well as could be expected, Eleanor replied, dismounting and reaching for Henry. The baby went to her willingly, his chubby hands patting her cheeks in greeting. "The twins are feeding the chickens," Mrs. Patterson informed them. "Been good as gold, all four of them." She lowered her voice. "Sheriff Taylor stopped by about an hour ago. Said Mason Reed is expecting you tomorrow morning." Griffin's jaw tightened. "Yes, I'm aware." The older woman studied him with concern. "Anything I can do to help? I don't have much, but—" "You've already done more than enough for watching the children," Griffin assured her. "We'll manage somehow." Mrs. Patterson didn't look convinced, but she merely nodded. "I'd best be getting home before dark. Don't hesitate to call if you need me again." After she departed, Griffin and Eleanor brought the horses to the barn, where they found the twins finishing their chores. Matthew and Luke greeted them enthusiastically, eager to share stories of their day's adventures. "We helped Mrs. Patterson make cookies," Luke announced proudly, "and I collected 8 eggs all by myself," Matthew added, not to be outdone. Eleanor listened to their chatter with a fond smile, though her mind was still working on their financial predicament. As Griffin led the horses into their stalls, she noticed him wince when he lifted the saddle. "You're hurting," she said quietly once the twins had run back to the house. Griffin shook his head dismissively. "It's nothing, just sore from the wrestling match." "Let me check it when we get inside," Eleanor insisted. "You may have torn something." Griffin's eyes met hers, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper warming his gaze. "Always taking care of us," he murmured. "Someone has to," she replied lightly, though her heart quickened at the intimacy in his voice. Inside the cabin, after the children had been fed, bathed, and put to bed, Eleanor examined Griffin's arm in the kitchen. The snake bite had healed considerably over the past weeks, but the surrounding area was now mottled with fresh bruising from the wrestling match. "You're lucky you didn't reopen the wound," she scolded, gently applying a soothing herbal salve she'd prepared from plants in Margaret's garden. "I had to try," Griffin said, watching her capable hands work. $50 would have made a difference." Eleanor nodded, understanding his desperation. "We've made good progress today. $205 is a substantial sum." "But not enough," Griffin replied grimly, "and we're running out of options." Eleanor tied off the fresh bandage, her fingers lingering momentarily on his wrist. "There must be something else we haven't considered." Griffin captured her hand before she could withdraw it, his calloused fingers enclosing hers. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and serious, "if we can't raise the money, if we lose the ranch, I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done." "We haven't lost yet," Eleanor reminded him, though her throat tightened at the resignation in his tone. "But if we do," Griffin persisted, "I need to say this now." He took a deep breath. "You came into our lives when we needed you most, and not just because of the snake bite. The children, they've flourished with you here. And he hesitated, his blue eyes searching hers. "I've found myself thinking of possibilities I'd given up on." Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. "Griffin, I know the timing is all wrong," he continued hurriedly, "with Reed's threat and your teaching position starting soon. But I can't let another day pass without telling you that I've come to care for you, Eleanor. Deeply." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I care for you too," she admitted softly. "More than I ever expected to. You and the children, you have become so important to me." Griffin's expression lightened with hope. "Even knowing you might lose everything tomorrow." Eleanor asked, the practical part of her mind still fixated on their dire situation. "Even then," Griffin confirmed, "whatever happens with the ranch, knowing how you feel gives me hope for the future." Eleanor was about to respond when a small sound from the doorway caught their attention. Charlotte stood there in her nightgown, her corn-husk doll clutched to her chest. "Charlotte," Griffin said, gently releasing Eleanor's hand, "what are you doing up, sweetheart?" "I had a dream," the little girl said, her voice small but clear. "Mama told me where to find the treasure." Griffin and Eleanor exchanged glances. "What treasure, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked, kneeling to Charlotte's level. "The one Mama hid," Charlotte replied with the absolute certainty only a child could possess. "She said to tell Papa to look behind the loose stone in the fireplace." Griffin's brow furrowed. "Charlotte, are you sure this was a dream? Maybe you heard a story, or—" "It was Mama," Charlotte insisted. "She was wearing her blue dress, and she told me to tell you now tonight. She said it would help keep our home." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. There was something uncanny about Charlotte's conviction about the timing of this dream. Griffin seemed to feel it too. He rose from his chair and moved to the fireplace, examining the stones that framed it. Did Mama say which stone, Charlotte? The little girl joined him, pointing confidently to a spot near the bottom right corner. That one, the one with the little star shape. Griffin knelt, running his fingers over the stones until he found one with a natural marking that did indeed resemble a tiny star. He pressed against it experimentally, and to Eleanor's astonishment, the stone shifted slightly. It's loose, Griffin murmured, working his fingers around the edges. With careful maneuvering, he managed to wiggle the stone free, revealing a small cavity behind it to you. Eleanor and Charlotte crowded close as Griffin reached inside, his expression changing to one of stunned disbelief as he withdrew a small leather pouch. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, tipping the contents onto the table. A gold wedding band set with a soul diamond, a pair of pearl earrings, and several gold coins spilled out glinting in the lamplight. Margaret's jewelry, Griffin whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought she had sold it all before Henry was born, when we needed money for the doctor. Eleanor picked up one of the coins, examining it closely. These are $20 gold pieces, she said in amazement. There are 5 of them. That's $100 right there. And the jewelry must be worth at least another $50. Griffin stared at the small treasure, then at his daughter. Charlotte, how did you know about this? I told you, Charlotte said patiently, as though explaining something obvious to a confused adult. Mama told me in my dream. She said she kept these special things hidden for when we really needed them. Griffin gathered Charlotte into his arms, holding her close as tears filled his eyes. Thank you, sweetheart, he murmured into her hair. Thank you for listening to Mama. Eleanor watched the scene with a strange mixture of emotions, joy at this unexpected solution to their financial crisis, wonder at Charlotte's remarkable intuition, and a peculiar feeling that Margaret McAllister's presence was somehow still watching over her family. We have enough, Eleanor said softly, counting the total value. With what we already raised, this puts us over $300. Griffin nodded, one arm still around Charlotte, the other reaching for Eleanor's hand. We can pay Reed tomorrow and keep the ranch. Charlotte looked between them, her solemn blue eyes wise beyond her years. Mama said Miss Eleanor needs to stay with us, she announced matter-of-factly. She said Miss Eleanor belongs here now. Griffin's gaze met Eleanor's over Charlotte's head, a question in his eyes that made her heart skip. Before either adult could respond, Charlotte yawned widely. Time for bed, young lady, Griffin said, scooping her up. You've been our hero tonight. As Griffin carried Charlotte back to bed, Eleanor remained at the table, staring at the small pile of valuables that had appeared like a miracle just when they needed it most. She didn't consider herself superstitious, but she couldn't deny the uncanny timing of Charlotte's dream. Had Margaret somehow reached across the divide between life and death to protect her family? Or had Charlotte simply remembered overhearing her mother mention the hiding place long ago? Either way, the result was the same: the ranch would be saved. Griffin returned a few minutes later, his expression still one of wonder. She fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow, he reported, as if her mission was accomplished. Perhaps it was, Eleanor replied thoughtfully. I've never seen anything like it. Griffin sat beside her, gathering the coins and jewelry back into the pouch. Margaret was always practical, always planning ahead. It would be like her to create an emergency fund and hide it. He shook his head in amazement. But for Charlotte to know exactly where to find it after all this time. Children are more perceptive than we give them credit for, Eleanor suggested, though she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. Perhaps she saw her mother hide something there once and only now remembered. Perhaps, Griffin agreed, though he sounded equally dubious. He set the pouch aside and took both of Eleanor's hands in his. Regardless of how it happened, we have enough to pay Reed tomorrow. The ranch is saved. Eleanor smiled, sharing his relief. And your watch and my brooch. We'll get them back, Griffin promised. The first money I earn once my arm is fully healed will go toward reclaiming them. Eleanor nodded, though secretly she didn't mind the loss of her brooch as much as she had expected. It had served a greater purpose in contributing to saving the McAllister home. What Charlotte said about you belonging here, Griffin began, his voice hesitant. I know you have your teaching position, and I would never ask you to give up the career you've worked for. But perhaps there's a way you could be part of our lives even after you begin teaching. Eleanor's heart quickened at his words. What are you suggesting, Griffin? He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I'm suggesting that maybe in time, if you felt it was right, you might consider making this your home permanently. The school is only 3 miles away. You could ride there daily and return in the evenings. And the children, Eleanor asked softly. They adore you, Griffin replied simply. You've seen how they've thrived with you here. Charlotte already thinks of you as... He trailed off, perhaps not wanting to presume too much. As a mother figure, Eleanor finished for him. Griffin nodded. Yes, and He faltered, then pressed on. I've come to care for you in a way I didn't think possible after losing Margaret. I know it's soon, perhaps too soon, but life on the frontier doesn't allow for long courtships. And after all we've been through together these past weeks, Eleanor squeezed his hands gently. Griffin McAllister, are you proposing to me? A flush crept up his neck, but his gaze remained steady. I suppose I am in a roundabout way. Not immediately, of course. We should have a proper courtship first, but eventually, yes, I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife and a mother to my children. Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. Just weeks ago, she had arrived in Wyoming seeking answers about her brother's death, carrying the burden of his connection to the McAllister family. Now, improbably, she found herself being offered a place in that very family, a second chance for all of them. I would be honored, she whispered, but there's so much to consider. The school board expects me to live in town during the term, and your neighbors the town they might talk if I continued staying here. Mrs. Patterson could chaperone, Griffin suggested immediately. She's already fond of you and the children. As for the school board, we could speak with them. Explain the situation. Eleanor smiled at his eagerness. Let's take this one step at a time, she advised. First, we pay off Reed tomorrow and secure the ranch. Then I begin my teaching position as planned. We can court properly with Mrs. Patterson as our chaperone if you wish. And when the time feels right, we'll know. Griffin finished, raising her hand to his lips. Thank you, Eleanor, not just for considering a future with us, but for everything you've done since the moment you arrived with that loaf of bread. They sat together in comfortable silence for a time, hands still joined, both contemplating the remarkable turn their lives had taken. Outside, the Wyoming night was filled with stars, the extra stars Margaret had once said God hung in the western sky to guide pioneers home. The following morning, Griffin and Eleanor rode into Willow Creek together, the pouch containing their combined funds secured inside Griffin's jacket. They had decided to arrive early, hoping to catch Reed at the bank before he could come to the ranch with the sheriff. The town was just beginning to stir as they tied their horses outside the bank. Griffin straightened his shoulders, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his bruised arm. Ready? Eleanor asked, standing close beside him. Griffin nodded, his expression resolute. More than ready to be done with Mason Reed. They entered the bank just as Reed was unlocking his office door. The banker turned at the sound of their entrance, surprise quickly masked by his usual calculating smile. McAllister, Miss Harlow, he greeted them. I wasn't expecting you so early. Have you come to accept my generous offer? I've come to pay my loan in full, Griffin replied evenly, producing the pouch. $300 is agreed. Reed's smile faltered momentarily. The full amount today. Right now, Griffin confirmed, his voice steady. Would you like to count it? Reed recovered his composure quickly, though Eleanor could see the disappointment in his eyes. Of course. Please step into my office. Inside the office, Reed meticulously counted the money, the gold coins from Margaret's hidden cash, the proceeds from Eleanor's brooch, the cash from the sale of Griffin's watch, and finally the voucher for $25 that Mr. Collins had provided for Eleanor's upcoming telegraph work. All seems to be in order, Reed said finally, his tone clipped. Though I must say I'm surprised you managed to raise this sum so quickly given your circumstances. We had help from unexpected sources, Griffin replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Reed's gaze flicked to Eleanor, a calculating look in his eyes. Indeed. He opened a drawer, withdrew a document, and signed it with a flourish. Here is the receipt confirming payment in full. The deed to your property remains in your name, free and clear. Griffin accepted the paper, carefully folding it and placing it in his pocket. Thank you, Mr. Reed. I believe our business is concluded. As they turned to leave, Reed called after them. One moment, Miss Harlow. Might I have a word with you privately? Eleanor exchanged a glance with Griffin, who frowned but nodded slightly. I'll wait outside, he said, his tone making it clear he wouldn't go far. When Griffin had left, Reed gestured for Eleanor to sit. She remained standing, unwilling to prolong this unexpected conversation. "What can I do for you, Mr. Reed?" she asked coolly. Reed studied her with unsettling intensity. "You're quite remarkable, Miss Harlow. Coming to a frontier town to teach, then somehow finding yourself intimately involved in saving a struggling ranch." He leaned forward. "One might wonder about your motivations." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "My motivations are my own concern, Mr. Reed." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But I knew your brother, Miss Harlow. Quite well, in fact." A chill ran through Eleanor at his words. "Jonathan? How did you know him?" Reed smiled thinly. "He worked for me briefly when he first arrived in Willow Creek, before he decided to pursue medicine under Dr. Wilson's guidance." Reed's expression grew calculating. He was a troubled young man carrying a heavy burden of guilt. About his parents' deaths certainly, but also about some indiscretions during his legal career in Boston. Eleanor felt her heart racing. Johnny had never mentioned working for Reed. "What are you implying, Mr. Reed?" "Merely that your brother confided certain things to me," Reed replied smoothly. "Things that might reflect poorly on the Harlow family name on you by association, should they become public knowledge, particularly if the school board were to hear of them." The threat was unmistakable. Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral. "Are you attempting to blackmail me, Mr. Reed?" Reed raised his eyebrows in mock offense. "Blackmail? My dear Miss Harlow, I'm simply having a conversation about family histories. Yours and mine." He paused deliberately. "And the McAllisters, of course." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "What do you know about the McAllisters?" "I know that your brother was the doctor who failed to save Margaret McAllister," Reed said bluntly. "I know he took his own life, shortly thereafter consumed by guilt. And I wonder if Griffin McAllister knows the full extent of your connection to his family's tragedy." "He knows," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I told him everything." Reed looked genuinely surprised by this. "Did you? How very honest of you." He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with newfound interest. "And he still welcomed you into his home, allowed you near his children? Fascinating." "Mr. McAllister is a compassionate man who understands that my brother's mistakes were not mine," Eleanor replied. "Now, if you've finished attempting to intimidate me, I should join him." Reed's smile returned cold and calculating. "Of course, but remember, Miss Harlow, Willow Creek is a small town with a long memory. Should you decide to make your arrangement with McAllister permanent, as I suspect you might, there will be talk. Questions about propriety, about your past, about your brother's role in Margaret's death." Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. "Is that meant to frighten me, Mr. Reed?" "Consider it friendly advice," he replied. "This community can be welcoming to newcomers, or it can make life exceedingly difficult for those who don't conform to expectations." "I'll keep that in mind," Eleanor said, turning toward the door. "Good day, Mr. Reed." As she reached for the doorknob, Reed spoke again. "One last thing, Miss Harlow. Your brother left something in my possession before he died, a journal, I believe. Personal writings, memories of Boston, that sort of thing. Should you be interested in having it returned, perhaps we could discuss an arrangement." Eleanor paused, her hand on the doorknob. Johnny's journal, it might contain answers about his final days, about what had really happened with Margaret's case. But making any deal with Reed seemed dangerous. "What sort of arrangement?" she asked cautiously. Reed spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Nothing too burdensome. Perhaps just your assurance that, as the new school teacher, you'll emphasize the importance of progress, specifically the benefits the railroad will bring to Willow Creek. Many of the local farmers and ranchers have been resistant to change." Eleanor understood immediately. Reed wanted her to use her position to influence the community's opinion about the railroad, the same railroad that would have run through the McAllister property had Reed succeeded in acquiring it. "I'll consider it," she said noncommittally, unwilling to engage further. "Good day, Mr. Reed." Outside, Griffin was waiting anxiously. "What did he want?" he asked as soon as Eleanor emerged. "To threaten me, essentially," Eleanor replied, taking his arm and guiding him away from the bank. "He knows about Johnny's connection to Margaret's case, and he implied he might make that knowledge public if I don't cooperate with him on some matter." Griffin's expression darkened. "That snake. What does he want from you?" "For me to promote the railroad's interests once I begin teaching," Eleanor explained. "And he claims to have one of Johnny's journals, which he's using as bait." Griffin stopped walking, turning to face her. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If you hadn't gotten involved with us, Reed wouldn't be targeting you. It's not your fault, Eleanor assured him. Reed is the type of man who looks for leverage wherever he can find it. He would have discovered my connection to Johnny eventually. She squared her shoulders. Besides, I'm not afraid of him. The truth about Johnny is already known to those who matter most, you and your children. Griffin's expression softened. You're remarkable. Do you know that? Most women would have fled at the first sign of trouble, yet here you are standing firm against Reed's threats. I'm not most women, Eleanor replied with a small smile. No, you certainly are not. Griffin agreed, his eyes warm with admiration. And I'm grateful for it every day. They continued toward the livery stable to retrieve their horses, both feeling lighter despite Reed's threats. The ranch was secure, at least for now. The future still held uncertainties. Eleanor's teaching position, the potential for gossip about their relationship, Reed's veiled threats, but they would face those challenges together. As they rode back to the ranch, Eleanor found herself thinking about Charlotte's dream and the hidden treasure that had saved their home. Perhaps Margaret McAllister had indeed found a way to protect her family one last time. And perhaps in bringing Eleanor to their door that fateful day, with a loaf of bread she had provided them with something even more valuable than gold coins and jewelry, a second chance at happiness. The next 3 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Eleanor fulfilled her commitment at the telegraph office, earning the promised $25. Combined with the funds they had already raised, they were able to redeem both Griffin's watch and Eleanor's cameo brooch from Mr. Davis at the general store. Griffin's arm continued to heal, allowing him to resume most of his duties around the ranch. The north field was planted, promising a modest harvest in the coming months. The children thrived under Eleanor's care, each developing a unique bond with her. The twins Matthew and Luke taught Eleanor about the wildlife surrounding the ranch, showing her where the deer came to drink and where the best fishing spots were located. Charlotte followed Eleanor everywhere, watching intently as she cooked, cleaned, and tended to baby Henry. And Henry himself had begun to babble, "Ooh-ah," whenever Eleanor entered the room, his chubby arms reaching for her with complete trust. As the start of the school term approached, Eleanor and Griffin discussed their arrangement with increasing urgency. They had agreed to a proper courtship, but the practical details of Eleanor's teaching responsibilities remained to be resolved. I've spoken with the school board, Eleanor reported one evening as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep. They're willing to be flexible about my living arrangements given the circumstances. What circumstances did you describe? Griffin asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Eleanor smiled. I may have emphasized that I was providing essential care for 4 motherless children while their father recovered from a serious injury. Mrs. Patterson vouched for my character and the propriety of the situation. And they accepted that, with some conditions, Eleanor admitted. I must be at the school by 7:30 each morning, which means leaving here quite early. And they have asked that Mrs. Patterson continue to serve as a chaperone of sorts, visiting regularly to maintain appearances. Griffin nodded thoughtfully. That seems reasonable, and it means you can continue living here while teaching. It does. Eleanor agreed, her heart warming at the quiet satisfaction in his voice. Though we should still be mindful of town gossip, especially after Reed's threats. Griffin reached for her hand, his expression growing serious. Eleanor, are you certain this is what you want, living here, helping with the children, dealing with the challenges of a ranch while teaching full time? It's a great deal to take on. Eleanor turned to face him fully. I've never been more certain of anything, Griffin. These past weeks have shown me where I belong here with you and the children. Even knowing the complications, the whispers that might follow you in town. Even then, she assured him. Besides, frontier towns have short memories when it comes to scandal. Once they see I'm a dedicated teacher and a respectable member of the community, the gossip will fade. Griffin's thumb traced gentle patterns on the back of her hand. And us, this courtship we've agreed upon. Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks despite herself. What about it? How long do you think we should wait before... He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Before formalizing our arrangement. Are you proposing again, Griffin McAllister? Eleanor asked, a teasing note in her voice despite the seriousness of the question. I'm asking for your thoughts on a timeline, he replied, though his eyes betrayed his deeper meaning. I don't want to rush you, but I also don't want to wait unnecessarily if we both know what we want. Eleanor considered his question thoughtfully. I think we should allow at least until Christmas, she said finally. That gives me time to establish myself we have as the school teacher, for the children to adjust to our new routine, and for us to be certain this is right for everyone involved. Griffin nodded, though she could see a hint of disappointment in his eyes. 4 months. That's reasonable. Eleanor squeezed his hand. It will pass quickly, and it gives us time for a proper courtship, visits to town together, Sunday services, perhaps even a harvest dance or two. A smile warmed Griffin's features. I'm a terrible dancer. Then I shall have to teach you, Eleanor replied lightly. Their conversation was interrupted by a small figure appearing in the doorway. Charlotte stood there in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Another dream sweetheart? Griffin asked, instantly alert. Charlotte shook her head. No, Papa. I'm thirsty. Eleanor rose to fetch her a cup of water. When she returned, Charlotte had climbed onto Griffin's lap, her head resting against his chest. Here you are, Eleanor said, handing the cup to the little girl. Charlotte drank deeply, then passed the cup back. Thank you, Mama, she murmured drowsily. Eleanor froze her eyes, meeting Griffin's over Charlotte's head. The child seemed unaware of what she had said, her eyelids already drooping as sleep reclaimed her. I should put her back to bed, Griffin said softly, standing with Charlotte cradled against him. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. Mama. Charlotte had called her Mama. When Griffin returned a few minutes later, Eleanor was still standing where he had left her, the empty cup in her hands. She's sound asleep, he reported. Probably won't remember any of this in the morning. She called me Mama, Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. Griffin approached her cautiously. Are you upset? No, Eleanor replied, surprised to find it was true. Just overwhelmed. I never expected. She shook her head, struggling to articulate her feelings. I don't want to replace Margaret in their lives. I can't replace her. Griffin gently took the cup from her hands, setting it aside before drawing her into his arms. You aren't replacing her, he assured her. You're creating your own place in their hearts, in all our hearts. Eleanor rested her head against his chest, finding comfort in the steady beat of his heart. Do you think Margaret would approve of me being here, of us, of everything? Griffin was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, he said finally. Margaret wanted nothing more than for her children to be loved and cared for, and for me to find happiness again when the time was right. He drew back slightly to look into her eyes. I believe she would be grateful to you, Eleanor, for saving me from that snake bite, for loving her children as your own, for bringing joy back into our home. Eleanor thought of Charlotte's dream of the hidden treasure that had appeared exactly when they needed it most. She thought of the strange sense she sometimes had, especially when with the children, that Margaret's presence lingered protectively around them. Perhaps she already knows, Eleanor said softly. Perhaps she's been watching all along. Griffin smiled, a peaceful expression she hadn't seen before settling over his features. Perhaps she has. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Eleanor's forehead. And perhaps she approves. So, the first day of school arrived with perfect autumn weather. Eleanor rose before dawn, dressing carefully in her best blue dress, with her reclaimed cameo brooch pinned at the collar. Griffin was already in the kitchen when she emerged, coffee brewing on the stove. Nervous? He asked, handing her a steaming cup. A little, she admitted. First impressions matter. You'll be wonderful, Griffin assured her. The children of Willow Creek are fortunate to have you as their teacher. Eleanor sipped her coffee gratefully. I've prepared lesson plans for every age group, but I'm still not certain how many students to expect. Dr. Wilson mentioned about 20 children of school age in the area, Griffin said, though not all may attend regularly, especially during harvest time. Eleanor nodded, familiar with the practical realities of frontier education. Children's attendance often depended on the seasonal needs of their families' farms and ranches. I should go soon, she said, glancing at the growing light outside. I want to arrive early to prepare the classroom. Griffin hesitated, then reached into his pocket. I have something for you, a small token for your first day. He held out a delicate handkerchief embroidered with wildflowers around the border and the initials EH in one corner. Griffin, it's beautiful, Eleanor said, accepting the gift with wonder. Did you embroider this yourself? He laughed. Hardly. Mrs. Patterson helped. The children picked the wildflowers for the pattern Charlotte was quite insistent about, including bluebells. Eleanor traced the intricate stitching with her fingertip. It's perfect, thank you. Something to keep with you today, Griffin said, his voice softening. A reminder that we're proud of you and thinking of you while you're away. Eleanor carefully tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve, then impulsively rose on tiptoe to press a quick kiss to Griffin's cheek. I'll be home before supper, she promised. The ride to town was peaceful, the early morning air crisp with the promise of autumn. Eleanor used the time to organize her thoughts, reviewing her plans for the day ahead. She had spent hours preparing her first lessons, determined to make a positive impression on both her students and the community. The schoolhouse was a simple but sturdy building on the edge of town, freshly painted white with a small bell tower. Eleanor tied her horse at the hitching post and unlocked the door with the key the school board had provided. Inside, rows of benches faced a larger desk at the front of the room. A blackboard covered most of the front wall, and bookshelves lined the back. The room was clean but austere. No decorations, no personal touches. Eleanor set about making the space more welcoming, arranging her books on the desk, writing a cheerful, "Welcome, students," on the blackboard, and placing a small vase of wildflowers she had gathered that morning on the windowsill. As the appointed hour approached, children began arriving in groups of 2 or 3. Some came with parents, others on their own. Eleanor greeted each one warmly, learning names and ages as they entered. By 8 o'clock, 18 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old had assembled. Eleanor rang the bell to officially begin the school day, feeling a surge of excitement as she faced her first class. "Good morning, students," she began. "I'm Miss Harlow, your new teacher. I'm looking forward to getting to know each of you and helping you learn and grow this term." The morning passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and initial lessons. Eleanor divided the students into groups based on age and ability, setting the older ones to reading assignments, while she worked directly with the younger children on their letters and numbers. At noon, the children spilled outside for lunch and play. Eleanor sat on the schoolhouse steps watching them with satisfaction. The morning had gone well, better than she had dared hope. The students were respectful and eager to learn, even the teenage boys who had initially seemed skeptical of their new teacher. As she unwrapped her own lunch, Eleanor noticed Mason Reed observing from across the street. Their eyes met briefly before he tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness and continued on his way. The encounter left Eleanor unsettled, reminding her of his veiled threats about Johnny's journal and the potential for gossip. The afternoon session was dedicated to history and geography, with Eleanor using maps to show the students their place in the expanding nation. She told stories of pioneers and settlers, carefully avoiding any mention of the railroad. She would not become Reed's puppet, regardless of his threats. When the final bell rang at 4 o'clock, Eleanor felt a deep sense of accomplishment mingled with exhaustion. Her first day as Willow Creek's teacher had been a success. As the last student departed, she began tidying the classroom, preparing for tomorrow's lessons. A knock at the open door interrupted her work. She looked up to find Dr. Wilson standing there, his kind face creased in a smile. "How was your first day, Miss Harlow?" he asked, entering at her welcoming gesture. "Wonderful," Eleanor replied honestly. "The children are bright and eager to learn." Wilson nodded approvingly. "I thought they might respond well to you. You have a natural way with young ones, something I've observed in your interactions with the McAllister children." Eleanor busied herself with straightening papers, uncertain how to respond to this observation. Dr. Wilson knew of her arrangement with the McAllisters, of course, but she was still cautious about discussing it openly. "Speaking of the McAllisters," the doctor continued, seemingly sensing her hesitation, "Griffin's arm appears to be healing nicely. I stopped by the ranch yesterday while you were in town." "Yes, he's regained most of his strength," Eleanor agreed, "though he still needs to be careful not to overexert himself." Dr. Wilson settled onto one of the student benches, regarding Eleanor thoughtfully. "I've known Griffin McAllister for many years, Miss Harlow. Delivered all 4 of his children. Watched him struggle after Margaret's death." He paused. "I've never seen him as at peace as he is now with you in their lives." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Dr. Wilson," he raised a hand to forestall her protest, "I'm not here to pry or to judge. Quite the opposite. I wanted you to know that you have my support, whatever arrangement you and Griffin decide upon." "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by his kindness. "That means a great deal, especially given the circumstances of how I came to know the family." Dr. Wilson's expression grew somber. Jonathan's connection to Margaret's case was unfortunate, but it was not your burden to bear. Yet you chose to stay to help to care for those children. That speaks to your character, Miss Harlow. Eleanor thought of Johnny's journal, still in Reed's possession. Dr. Wilson, did my brother leave any papers or personal effects with you before he died? The doctor shook his head. Only a brief note, which I gave to the sheriff at the time. Why do you ask? Mason Reed claims to have one of Johnny's journals, Eleanor explained. He's using it as leverage to try to persuade me to promote the railroad's interest in my teaching. Dr. Wilson's bushy eyebrows drew together in concern. That sounds like Reed, always looking for an angle. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. I wouldn't put too much stock in his claims. Reed is known to bluff when it suits him. Even so, I would like to recover Johnny's journal if it does exist, Eleanor said, but not at the cost of compromising my principles. A wise stance, Dr. Wilson approved. Be careful with Reed, Miss Harlow. He doesn't take defeat gracefully, as you've seen with Griffin's loan. Eleanor nodded, appreciating the warning. I'll be cautious. As Dr. Wilson rose to leave, he paused at the door. One more thing, Miss Harlow. There's to be a harvest festival in 2 weeks, of community gathering with food, music, dancing. It would be an excellent opportunity for you to meet more of the townspeople in a social setting. His eyes twinkled. And perhaps a certain rancher and his children might enjoy an outing as well. Eleanor smiled at the doctor's transparent matchmaking. Thank you for the suggestion, Dr. Wilson. I'll certainly consider attending. After the doctor departed, Eleanor finished her preparations for the following day, then gathered her things to return to the ranch. To return home, she corrected herself mentally. The ride back was peaceful, the setting sun painting the Wyoming landscape in gold and crimson. Eleanor found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in the short time since she had arrived in Willis Creek. She had come seeking answers about her brother's death, carrying the weight of his mistakes. She had found a family, a purpose, and a love she hadn't been looking for. As the McAllister Ranch came into view, Eleanor saw Charlotte standing on the porch watching for her return. The little girl waved excitedly, then disappeared inside, presumably to announce Eleanor's arrival. By the time Eleanor dismounted, all 4 children had gathered on the porch, with Griffin standing behind them, a warm smile on his face. The twins raced down the steps to greet her, bombarding her with questions about the school and her day. Charlotte hung back slightly, watching Eleanor with those perceptive blue eyes, while Griffin held baby Henry, who was reaching toward Eleanor with impatient hands. Welcome home, Griffin said simply as she climbed the steps. Eleanor took Henry into her arms, her heart full as she gazed at the 5 faces before her, the family that had somehow become hers in the space of a few extraordinary weeks. It's good to be home, she replied, knowing with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Griffin McAllister stood once again in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking his ranch. This time, however, he wasn't digging in the moonlight, but standing before a newly installed headstone that had replaced the weathered wooden cross on Margaret's grave. The stone was simple but elegant, carved from local granite. It read, Margaret Ann McAllister, 1848 and 1875, beloved wife and mother, love is stronger than death. Griffin knelt, brushing a light dusting of snow from the base of the stone. It's finished, Maggie, he said softly, just as I promised. A proper marker for you, one that will last for generations. He glanced back toward the ranch, where smoke curled from the chimney of the cabin. Through the window, he could see Eleanor moving about the kitchen, preparing Christmas dinner with Charlotte's help. The twins were visible in the yard, engaged in a snowball fight, while baby Henry, not such a baby anymore, at 16 months, was likely napping in his crib. They're doing well, all of them. Griffin continued, speaking to his first wife's memory. Growing so fast. Charlotte still talks about her dreams of you. Says you visit her sometimes just to check on us. He smiled faintly. I'd like to think that's true. He traced the carved letters of Margaret's name with his fingertips. I've asked Eleanor to marry me properly this time, with a ring and everything. We're planning a small wedding after New Year's, if that meets with your approval. He paused, as if listening for a response. Charlotte says you've already given your blessing, but I wanted to tell you myself directly. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the nearby trees, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Griffin sat in silence for a moment, remembering the vibrant, laughing woman who had shared the first part of his life's journey. "I'll always love you, Maggie," he said finally. "That hasn't changed. But I've found room in my heart for Eleanor, too. She saved us in more ways than one, starting with that rattlesnake bite and that loaf of bread she brought." He smiled at the memory. "Sometimes I think you might have had a hand in sending her to us that day." Standing, Griffin brushed the snow from his knees. "Merry Christmas, my dear. I'll bring the children to see your new stone tomorrow." As he walked back toward the ranch, Griffin felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for so long after Margaret's death. The grief hadn't disappeared, it never would, but it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet memory that could coexist with his new happiness. Eleanor met him at the door, her green eyes warm with understanding. She had encouraged him to commission the headstone, knowing how important it was to him to honor Margaret properly before they began their life together. "Everything all right?" she asked softly, taking his cold hands in her warm ones. Griffin nodded. "Everything is perfect," he replied, drawing her close. "Absolutely perfect." Inside the cabin was transformed for Christmas. Pine boughs decorated the mantelpaper, chains made by the children hung from the ceiling, and delicious aromas filled the air. Charlotte was setting the table with their best dishes, her face solemn with concentration. The twins burst through the door in a flurry of snow and laughter, cheeks red from their outdoor play. "Papa, Miss Eleanor, can we open one present before dinner, please?" Luke begged, his eyes bright with excitement. "Just one," Matthew echoed, employing his most persuasive expression. Eleanor and Griffin exchanged amused glances. "What do you think?" Griffin asked her, deferring to her judgment, as he increasingly did in matters concerning the children. "I suppose one small gift each wouldn't hurt," Eleanor conceded, unable to resist their eager faces. "But then we eat, and the rest must wait until after dinner." The children cheered, rushing to the small pine tree in the corner where a modest collection of wrapped packages waited. Even Henry, awakened from his nap by the commotion, joined in the excitement, clapping his hands from his place in Charlotte's arms. As Griffin watched his family, for that was truly what they had become, he felt a swell of gratitude so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. 1 year ago, he had been a grieving widower, struggling to raise 4 small children, alone, drowning in debt and despair. Now his home was filled with laughter and love, once more, his ranch secure, his heart healing. And it had all begun with a rattlesnake, 4 motherless children, and a woman who arrived bearing a loaf of bread when they needed her most. "Penny, for your thoughts," Eleanor murmured, coming to stand beside him as the children examined the packages under the tree. Griffin slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "I was just thinking about the strange paths life takes us down," he replied. "How sometimes the worst moments can lead to the most unexpected blessings." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "Like a snake bite leading to a second chance at love." "Exactly like that," Griffin agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor." "Merry Christmas, Griffin," she replied softly, the first of many together. As they joined the children around the Christmas tree, the warmth of their expanding family enveloped them. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in pristine white, while inside the McAllister cabin, a new chapter was beginning, one built on healing hope and the enduring power of love to transform even the deepest loss into unexpected joy.